The oxygen mask on seat 6 was still swinging when flight PK-447 lost both pilots. Not a metaphor, not a training simulation. 31,000 feet above the Balochistan Plateau, in real air with real passengers, the left seat was empty because Captain Rashid Hafiz had collapsed across the center console with his hand still on the throttle, and the right seat was empty because First Officer Tariq Mahmoud had made it exactly 4 steps toward the galley before his legs stopped working. Farida Raza had been asleep. She had specifically chosen seat 6A on the left side of the aircraft because the wing obscured most of the engine view, and she found the hum of the engine comforting rather than alarming. She had a window shade pulled down. She had a thin blue airline blanket tucked around her knees. She had her reading glasses folded in her lap because she had been reading a maintenance manual on turbofan inlet geometries before she drifted off, and the manual was now on the floor because the aircraft had lurched. That was what woke her, the lurch. Not the announcement that followed that came a full 12 seconds later, which in aviation terms is not a delay, it is a geological age, but the sensation that the nose had dropped 2 degrees and then corrected, automated systems catching what human hands had stopped holding, and the correction itself was slightly wrong, slightly overcautious, and Farida felt it in her spine before she consciously registered it. She opened her eyes. The oxygen mask above her had deployed. That meant the cabin pressure had changed, or the system had detected something that triggered automatic deployment, which could mean several things, most of them serious. The passenger in 6B, a heavyset man in a beige Solwar camis, was staring at his mask with the expression of someone who had been handed a live animal and was unsure what to do with it. Farida put on her mask without thinking. She did it the way she put on her seatbelt, automatic muscle memory from a different life. She pressed the button for the flight attendant. Nothing happened for 30 seconds. She pressed again. The intercom crackled, a voice young and barely holding itself together. Please remain in your seat. Please do not be alarmed. We are. Please remain in your seat. The voice cut off. Farida stood up. Before you go any further with this story, I want to ask you something. If you have watched this channel before, you already know that we do not write easy stories here. We write real ones, the kind that stay with you. If this is your first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay until the last line because this story does not end where you think it will. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? I want to know who is listening. Now back to seat 6. Farida Raza was 44 years old. She was listed on the passenger manifest as a civil servant, which was technically accurate. She had been employed by the Pakistan Civil Aviation Authority for the past 6 years as a safety standards officer, which involved a great deal of paperwork, a moderate amount of travel, and almost no time in the air. Before that, she had been squadron leader Farida Raza of the Pakistan Air Force, Mirage III conversion qualified, later F-16, and for a period of 4 years that she rarely discussed and never mentioned on her PCAA employment forms, she had been in an evaluation program for the F-16 Fighting Falcon at PAF Base Musharraf in Sargodha, which at the time was training the first cohort of female PAF pilots for advanced fast jet operations. She had left the program before the evaluation completed. This was the fact about herself that she carried the way some people carry an old injury, quietly with practiced adjustment, so that most days she did not feel it at all, and then occasionally, at unexpected moments, it ached. She had not flown anything in 3 years. She walked forward toward the cockpit. The senior flight attendant intercepted her in the forward galley. Her name tag said Sadia and her face said she had been maintaining professional composure for the last 4 minutes by sheer will and was running out of will. Ma'am, please return to. What happened to the crew? Sadia blinked. There has been a medical. Both pilots. The way Sadia's face changed answered the question. Food, Farida said. Was it the crew meal? Sadia's eyes went to the galley counter and back to Farida. The crew meal is separate from the passenger meal. The pilots ate something this morning before boarding, both of them. Did they share a meal from catering? I don't. It doesn't matter right now. Farida looked at the cockpit door. It was closed. Is the door locked? I don't have. The override requires. Does the ground know? We declared Mayday 12 minutes ago. Karachi ATC is. They're trying to reach any pilot on the aircraft. Open the door. Sadia looked at her, really looked at her. There was something in the look that Farida recognized, the same calculation that junior officers made when they were deciding whether to follow an order from someone who was not technically in their chain of command. It was the calculation of, does this person know what they are doing or are they just confident? Farida said nothing more. She waited. Sadia opened the door. The cockpit smelled of coffee and something else, something wrong, and Captain Hafiz was still slumped across the center console. He was breathing. That was the first thing Farida confirmed. His color was bad gray-green, which suggested a gastrointestinal event of significant force, but his chest was moving. Tariq Mahmoud had been moved to the space behind the seats, and one of the male flight attendants was on his knees beside him checking his pulse. The aircraft was on autopilot. The autopilot was doing its job with the calm indifference of machinery, holding 31,000 feet and a heading of 245 degrees, which was roughly the correct direction for Karachi, but only roughly. And the roughly would matter because Karachi's airspace required specific approach corridors, and the autopilot did not know about the high ground to the northeast, or the restricted military airspace to the west, or the fact that Paya Tower was currently coordinating an emergency response, and needed someone in the left seat who could actually talk. Farida sat in the left seat. She moved Captain Hafiz's hand from the throttle gently. He did not resist. She put on the headset. Static, then cutting through it. PK-447, this is Karachi approach. If there is anyone on this aircraft who can hear us, please respond. PK-447, Karachi approach over. The voice on the other end was male, clipped, professional, and underneath the professionalism, there was the sound of a man who was managing a situation that had approximately 17 moving parts and was not comfortable with any of them. Farida picked up the radio. Karachi approach, this is PK-447. A pause, very short, then, PK-447, please identify, state your qualifications and current status. She gave them what she had, her PAF background, her F-16 evaluation history. The fact that she had not flown commercially, had not flown anything in 3 years, and was not type-rated on the Boeing 737 MAX 8, which was what she was currently sitting in. Another pause, longer. Then a new voice came on the frequency, older, more authority. PK-447, this is Air Vice Marshal Seed Norala, Pakistan Air Force Air Operations. We are listening. What is your current status? Farida checked the instruments. She had flown enough aircraft to read an instrument panel, even an unfamiliar one, the way a literate person can read a foreign language with a familiar alphabet slowly, with effort, translating rather than reading naturally. Altitude 31,200, speed 445 knots. Fuel, she found the fuel gauges adequate, autopilot engaged, both engines nominal. She told them, PK-447, do you have any commercial pilot experience at all? Negative. Do you have training on fly-by-wire systems? F-7PG is conventional, Mirage III is conventional. I have sim hours on F-16 fly-by-wire from the Mushaf evaluation program, but I want to be clear, this aircraft is not an F-16. The handling philosophy is completely different. Understood, a brief pause, and then, are the pilots completely incapacitated? Captain Hafiz is breathing, he cannot be woken. First Officer Mahmoud is the same. I have no medical capability on board beyond a basic first aid kit. I need someone to tell me if there is any chance either of them recovers in the next 40 minutes. 40 minutes. That is approximately how long we have before I need to make a decision about descent. The frequency held for a moment, then Norala said, stand by, PK-447. The aircraft held its heading. The autopilot made small adjustments. Outside the windshield, the sky was the flat white of high altitude, the sun at an angle that put its glare directly in Farida's eyeline, and she reached up and found the sun visor without looking for it, the way you find familiar things in an unfamiliar room. Sadia appeared in the cockpit doorway. The passengers know something is wrong. Tell them we have a medical situation with the crew and that we are in contact with ground control. Do not tell them anything else. They will ask. Let them ask, tell them we are handling it, keep them calm, keep them seated, make sure everyone's belts are fastened. Farida did not look away from the instruments, and I need to know if there is a doctor on board. We asked when the captain collapsed. There is a retired GP in row 18. He is 67 years old. Good enough, I need him to assess both pilots. I need to know if there is any possibility of either of them regaining enough function to assist with landing. Sadia disappeared. Norala came back on the frequency. PK-447, we have your flight records from PCAA. We also have your PAF service record. A pause that carried weight. We want to walk you through this. We have a retired PIA captain at Karachi Approach who is going to be your primary guide. His name is Captain Imtiaz Badi. He knows the 737 MAX systems. Roger. We also want to be honest with you. Landing this aircraft will be extremely difficult. You will need to disengage autopilot at some point. The aircraft handles differently from anything you have flown. I know. Are you prepared for that? The honest answer was no. The honest answer was that the last time she had sat in a cockpit with real consequence, not a simulator, not a check ride, not a standardization eval, was 11 years ago, and the aircraft had been a mirage and the stakes had been her own life and no one else's. The honest answer was that her hands were slightly cold and her breathing was slightly fast, and she was running a continuous calculation in the back of her mind about what the probability of survival was, and the number she kept arriving at was not comfortable. She said, "I'm prepared." The first thing Captain Imtiaz Badi told her was to leave the autopilot alone for now. He had the voice of a man who had spent 20 years managing emergencies by speaking at the same pace whether the situation was routine or catastrophic, which was the single most useful quality a human voice could have on a radio frequency at that moment. And Farida found herself calibrating to it the way she used to calibrate to a section leader's call sign, not following exactly, but using it as a reference point. PK-447, the autopilot will hold you for now. Let it work. Your job right now is to understand the cockpit. I'm going to walk you through the instruments one by one. Tell me what you see. She told him. He corrected her on 2 readings. She had misread the altimeter setting because the 737 used a different subscale configuration than she was used to, and confirmed the rest. He walked her through the fuel state in detail. She had more than she thought, because one gauge she had read as a main tank was actually a reserve indicator. Good, that gives us options. Are you comfortable with the auto throttle? I can see it, I haven't touched it. Leave it alone. The auto throttle and autopilot together are your best friends right now. Do you know what the minimums are for autopilot disconnect? She didn't. He told her, then he told her what would happen when she disconnected, the physical sensation, the change in control feel, what the aircraft would want to do and why, and what she should do about it. It took 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, the aircraft flew itself in a long, gentle arc, and in the passenger cabin, Sadia and her colleagues moved through the rows with the disciplined calm of people who had trained for crisis, and were discovering that training and reality had a significant gap between them. The retired GP from row 18 had assessed both pilots and returned to Farida with the news she had expected. Both men were suffering acute gastrointestinal distress of sufficient severity that they were not going to be useful in the next 40 minutes. He framed it in medical language. Farida translated it into operational language in her own mind. She was alone. A passenger had heard this exchange. His name, she would learn it later, not then, was Asif Karim. He was 40 years old, a structural engineer from Lahore, and he had been listening to the conversation with the attentive focus of a man who builds things and therefore understands systems. He had no aviation background. He had no relevant qualification, but he appeared in the cockpit doorway 2 minutes after the doctor left and said very quietly, "Is there anything I can do that does not require knowing how to fly?" Farida looked at him. "Can you read instruments if someone tells you what they mean?" "Yes." "Can you write down numbers accurately?" "Yes." "Sit there," she pointed at the right seat. "Don't touch anything. If I tell you to read a number, read it out loud and then write it down. If anything starts making a sound you haven't heard before, tell me." He sat down. He did not ask any more questions. This was the thing she would remember later, more clearly than almost anything else about that day, that a structural engineer from Lahore sat in the right seat of a Boeing 737 and simply did what he was asked without demanding that someone explain to him why it mattered or whether she was qualified. Karachi ATC came back on the frequency with an update on the approach plan. They wanted her to attempt an ILS approach to runway 25L. The instrument landing system would provide electronic glide slope and localizer guidance, displayed on instruments she had been shown but never relied on in an actual aircraft. The 737 could fly the approach on autopilot to a very low altitude, and the very optimistic theory, was that she would only need to take over manually in the final few hundred feet. The theory assumed she could handle those final few hundred feet. PK-447, we also have a contingency, Norala said. We have 2 PAF F-16s from Masroor departing now to fly escort. They cannot land the aircraft for you, but they can observe and communicate. And a pause, Wing Commander Asin Khalid is one of the pilots. He has trained instructors on the F-16 program at Mushaf. He may know of you. The frequency crackled, a new voice, slightly compressed by the fighter jet's radio system. PK-447, this is Falcon 1, Flight Lieutenant Raza. She had been flight lieutenant then, she corrected him automatically. Squadron leader. A pause, then with something underneath it that she could not quite name. Squadron leader Raza, I remember your program. We need to get you and everyone on that aircraft down safely. Roger, Falcon 1. One question when you left the program, was that your choice? It was not an appropriate question for this frequency. It was not an appropriate moment. She understood immediately why he was asking it. He was doing a rapid assessment of her psychological state, specifically of whether there was a confidence problem she was carrying from the circumstances under which she had left fast jet training, and she appreciated the professionalism underneath the apparently inappropriate question. She answered honestly, no. I thought so, he said it without emphasis. Then you already know you can do this. She did not respond. The response would have taken too long to explain, and what it would have said was, knowing you can do something and actually doing it are separated by a distance that confidence alone cannot cross. She had known she could complete the F-16 conversion. She had passed every evaluation she had been allowed to sit. The reason she had left the program was not because she had failed. It was because an Air Commodore whose name she still remembered, Farrukh Jamal, silver hair, always smelled of Peshawari Kawa, retired now, or so she had heard, had determined that an operational fast-jet squadron was not an appropriate environment for a female officer at that time, and he had had the authority to act on that determination, and he had used it. She had filed an objection through the appropriate channels. The appropriate channels had absorbed the objection without response. 3 months later, she had resigned her commission. None of this was relevant to the next 40 minutes. She closed the memory the way you close a door in a burning building, not because the room is not important, but because you are going somewhere else and the door needs to be closed. Imtiaz Badi came back on frequency. He was going to walk her through the descent configuration. PK-447, I need you to identify the speed brake handle. It is on the center console, long vertical lever. Tell me when you have it. She found it, told him. Good, do not touch it yet. Now tell me the position of the flap lever. She found it, she told him. He walked her through what each flap setting did, not the technical explanation, but the practical effect on handling. She listened and made herself a mental map, because in the F-16 evaluation she had learned that the difference between a pilot who survives an emergency and a pilot who does not is usually not raw skill. It is usually whether they understand what the aircraft will do before they ask it to do it. She was going to ask this aircraft to do something it was not designed to resist, and she was not certified to request, and she needed to understand every step of what it would do in response. The retired GP reappeared. Captain Hafiz is conscious. Farida turned. Can he talk? He can speak. He is very ill. He cannot sit up without. Bring him. They brought him. It took 3 people and it was undignified, and Captain Hafiz, a broad man, mid-50s, with a gray beard and 22 years of Paya service, sat in the right seat with Asif Karim moving to crouch behind them, and Hafiz looked at the instruments with the eyes of a man trying to wake himself up more than his body was allowing. What's our, he stopped, swallowed carefully, what's our state? Farida told him, altitude, fuel, heading, approach plan. She kept it brief. He nodded slowly. He looked at her hands. He looked at the seat position she had set. She had adjusted it by feel, the way she adjusted any cockpit, and had put it approximately right. You've done your lateral trim. She had not thought about it. She checked. The aircraft had been trimmed by the autopilot throughout, and the trim state was acceptable but not optimal for her seating position. She made the adjustment. Hafiz nodded again. He did not say anything that could be interpreted as praise. He said, the flare is going to surprise you. Tell me. The 737 floats. You're going to think you're too high and you'll push the nose and it'll be fine. But your instinct from a fighter is going to say nose down more than this aircraft wants. Trust the sink rate, don't fight it. How much runway are we going to use? At your approach speed, assuming you get it right, you're going to touch down at the 500-meter mark or later. That's acceptable on 25L. 25L gives you 3,200 meters. You have margin. He paused, swallowed again more carefully. The nose wheel is going to come down hard. You're going to want to hold it off. Resist that. Let it come down. Auto brake. Set it to max now. Don't wait for touchdown. She reached for the auto brake selector, found it, set it. Hafiz said, good. Then he closed his eyes for a moment. I'm not going to be able to help you at the end. I can tell you things, but my hands are. He held one up briefly. It was shaking with the effort. I'm sorry. You've told me what I needed. He looked at her, something moved in his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief. Who are you? She told him not everything, the short version. He said very quietly, Mushaf program. Yes. He looked at her hands again, then at the instruments. He said nothing more. The F-16 escort arrived 20 minutes later. She heard them before she could see them, a brief reference on the frequency. Falcon 1 and Falcon 2 now in visual contact. And then Asim Khalid's voice saying, PK-447, we have you at your 9 o'clock position, and she looked out the left window and there was the unmistakable silhouette of an F-16 fighting Falcon, gray against the high white sky, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet. Khalid said, looking good from here. She knew he was being optimistic. She could see by the visual angle that the aircraft was carrying a slight left bank that the autopilot was correcting, and the correction was slightly sluggish, which suggested the autopilot was working harder than it should, which could mean nothing or could mean that the left control surfaces were not responding with full authority. She told him what she saw. A pause, check your roll surface indicator. She found it, there was a minor discrepancy on the left aileron position readout. Batty came immediately onto the frequency. That's a known caution item on the MAX series. It does not affect autopilot authority significantly. It will affect manual handling at low speed. You need to know that your left aileron response in the flare will be slightly reduced. You will need to correct with right rudder. How much? Not much, you'll feel it before you can quantify it. Trust the feel. Trust the feel? In a fly-by-wire philosophy aircraft that she had never flown before with a control law set she did not know, he was telling her to trust the feel. She understood why he was saying it. He was saying it because it was actually true, that at some point instruction runs out and the only thing left is the relationship between a pilot's hands and an aircraft, and that relationship either exists or it does not. She had last built that relationship with a Mirage III. She built the mental bridge she had to, there was no other choice. Descent began at her instruction to the autopilot 22 minutes out from the field. The aircraft responded the way autopilot descents responded, smoothly, impersonally, with the steady competence of a system that did not feel the significance of what it was doing. The altimeter unwound, the speed held. The flap lever stayed where it was at clean configuration because Batty had told her to stay clean until 18 miles. Asif Karim said from behind the seats, it's getting louder. He was right, the engine note had changed slightly with the power reduction for descent. He was listening to the aircraft the way a structural engineer listened to a building, for the sounds that indicated something changing. That's normal, she said, tell me if it gets quieter suddenly. He filed that instruction away. She could tell from how he received it that he understood the operational logic. Quiet engines at the wrong time meant something had changed in the fuel or power system. He was not a pilot. He was capable of monitoring the right things. At 18 miles, Batty walked her through the first flap setting. The autopilot would hold the aircraft level while she extended. She reached for the flap lever. She found the first detent. She moved the lever. She felt, or believed she felt, the aircraft settle slightly as the flaps extended, drag increasing, the nose wanting to rise a fraction, the auto throttle adding power to compensate. Flaps 1, she said. Confirm on the indicator. She confirmed. The flap position indicator showed 1. Good, now I need you to verify the ILS frequency. She found the nav radio panel. The frequency was already set. The ground crew at Karachi had uplinked the ILS frequency remotely through the aircraft's data link, because there were people on the ground doing everything they could from below, and that was something she had not had time to acknowledge but was aware of, the way you are aware of anything you cannot look at directly. At 12 miles, Batty said, PK-447, at 10 miles I need you to begin evaluating manual takeover. The autopilot will take you to minimums, but I want you mentally prepared for the moment you disconnect. When do I disconnect? Decision height is 200 feet. At 200 feet, the autopilot alarm will sound and you have approximately 12 seconds to decide whether the runway is in sight and the aircraft is properly aligned. If both conditions are met, you disconnect and land. And if one condition is not met, then you continue on autopilot past minimums and hope for a Category III approach, which the aircraft is equipped for but which you are not certified for, and which requires the runway visual range to be at specific minimums. Give me the number. 75 meters. She looked out the windshield. The haze below them was light. She could see the coastline of Karachi forming in the distance, the industrial port area, the gray-brown sprawl of the city, and beyond it the flat gray of the Arabian Sea. The visibility looked acceptable, better than 75 meters. "I'll have visual at minimums," she said. "Probably, but I'll have visual." A pause on the frequency, then Roger. At 10 miles, the ILS began to live on her instruments. The localizer needle appeared on the HSI, showing her displacement left and right of the centerline. The glide slope needle appeared on the attitude indicator, showing her displacement above or below the glide path. Both needles were centered, the autopilot holding the aircraft on the correct approach path with mechanical precision. She watched the needles. She had not flown an ILS in 11 years. She had flown many. The basic scan never changed. You looked at the needles and you flew toward the center, and when the center moved, you corrected. The instruments did not care whether the aircraft was a Mirage or a Boeing. The geometry of a glide path was the same at any weight and any speed. What changed was everything else. "Falcon 1, I have the field in sight," she said. "Khalid, confirm you are aligned. Wind is calm. You have a beautiful approach." He was not being sentimental. He was providing situational awareness in the most efficient format available. She appreciated it. Flaps 5, then 15, then 25. The aircraft slowed, the sound changed, the feel changed. At flaps 25, the aircraft was no longer the tight, clean thing it had been in cruise. It was heavier, blunter, aware of its weight, and the controls in manual would feel different from anything she had trained on. She reminded herself she was not in manual yet. "Gear down," Batty said. She reached for the gear handle. She had checked it twice already to know where it was. She pulled it down. She felt the clunk and rumble of 3 gear legs extending and locking, a sensation she had felt in every aircraft she had ever flown, the same basic physics, the landing gear finding its extended position with a certainty that was almost reassuring. 3 green, Asif said from behind her. She had not told him to watch the gear indicator. He had found it himself, had understood what 3 green lights meant, and had told her without being asked. "Good," she said. Hafiz from the right seat, his voice thinner now, "Flaps 40. Batty simultaneously, "Flaps 40 on my mark, mark." She selected flaps 40. The aircraft settled into full landing configuration. It felt heavier was not the right word, more committed, as if the aircraft itself understood that there was now a decision locked in. 5 miles 4-3. The altimeter was reading 2,000 feet, then 1,500, then 1,200. She could see runway 25L clearly now. It was a wide gray stripe in the urban haze, and she could see the approach lighting system, and she could see the threshold markings, and she could see that the alignment was good. The autopilot had put her exactly where she needed to be. 1,000 feet. PK 447, approaching minimums, be ready for autopilot disconnect. Her right hand moved to the autopilot disconnect button on the control wheel. She found it. She had memorized its location 40 minutes ago by touching it repeatedly without pressing it, the way you memorize a key by touching it before you need to use it in the dark. 800 feet. PK 447 status. Visual aligned, ready. 600 feet. 400. The autopilot alarm sounded, a synthetic voice in the cockpit, minimums, minimums. She pressed the disconnect. The control wheel came alive in her hands. The difference was immediate and significant, and she had been told to expect it, and even the expectation had not fully prepared her for the reality. The aircraft was alive in a way that autopilot managed flight was not. It had texture. It had intention. It wanted to do things, and some of those things were correct and some of them were not, and the difference between them was not large, but it was real, and she had approximately 10 seconds to establish the pattern of correction before the ground made the question moot. The left bank she had suspected from the aileron discrepancy began immediately, a slow roll to the left that was less than 2 degrees but was perceptible, and she corrected with right rudder as Batty had told her, and the aircraft leveled, and then the nose started to rise fractionally as the increased drag of full flap configuration tried to bleed her speed, and she checked back with a small forward pressure, and then the threshold was passing under her and she was in the flare. Hafiz had said, "Trust the sink rate." Her instinct said, "Nose down." She held the instinct. The aircraft floated, exactly as Hafiz had said it would. It was above the runway and it was settling, and her hands wanted to push and she would not let them, and the float went on for what felt like 5 full seconds of extreme concentration, and then the main gear touched. It touched hard, harder than a qualified pilot would have allowed. The aircraft bounced once, a single small skip, and she held the nose up, felt the aerodynamic braking working, felt the auto brake beginning to bite, and the nose wheel came down of its own accord with a crack that she heard and felt simultaneously, and the aircraft was on the runway, decelerating straight, using the center line. She kept her feet on the rudder pedals. She kept the thrust levers at idle. She let the auto brake do its work, and she steered the aircraft down the center line, and she did not do anything else because the rule at this moment was, stop doing things that are not necessary. The aircraft decelerated through 80 knots, through 60, through 40. At 25 knots, she put her hand on the thrust levers and confirmed them at idle. At walking pace, she brought the aircraft to a complete stop on the runway surface. There was a moment of absolute stillness. Then Batty came on the frequency, and his voice was the same pace it had been for the last 40 minutes, the same measured professional calm, and what he said was, "PK 447, you are on the runway. Well done, retain position. Emergency vehicles are inbound." Asif Karim from behind her said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We stopped." "Yes," Farida said. "On the ground." "Yes." He let out a long breath. She could hear in it several minutes of compressed fear that he had been holding in the same place he had put the numbers she gave him to write down. Hafiz in the right seat had his eyes open. He was looking at the runway centerline through the windshield. He said very quietly something she almost did not hear, "Who stopped your program?" She did not answer. "Jamal," he said. It was not a question. He had heard names over 22 years. He had heard the story the way that people in the PAF community heard all stories, sideways, secondhand, years after the fact. "I heard about it. I never knew who the pilot was." She said nothing. "You should have been flying," he said. She kept her eyes on the centerline. "It doesn't matter now. It matters to the 231 people behind us." He was quiet for a moment. "It mattered today." The emergency vehicles were visible in the distance, coming along the taxiway at speed, their lights making patterns in the afternoon haze. She watched them come. She reached up and began running through the shutdown checklist, the way you finish a job, methodically in order, without skipping steps, because the way you finish tells you something about what you have become. In the passenger cabin, the announcement system was still on. Sadia had not made an announcement. She was standing in the forward galley with her hand on the PA handset, and she was crying, but not in a way that made sound, only in the way where the tears are moving and the face is completely still. The passengers began to understand in the uneven, overlapping way that passengers understand things, some of them immediately, some of them only when they heard the sounds of the emergency response outside, some of them only when the aircraft stopped and did not move and nothing terrible had happened. A woman in row 14 began to pray out loud. Others joined her. In row 22, a young man who had spent the last 30 minutes holding the armrests with both hands released them and looked at his palms as if checking that they were still his. A girl of perhaps 7 in row 9, who had been asleep through most of the descent because her mother had held her and made her keep her eyes closed, woke up and looked out the window and saw the emergency vehicles and said, "Are we there?" Her mother said, "Yes, we're there." The hatch opened. Air Marshal Norala was not on the field himself. He was at Karachi Air Operations, but he was on the radio and his voice had changed. Still professional, but changed. He said, "Squadron Leader Raza." She said, "Sir." He said, "We are going to need a full debrief. There are questions about the catering incident and about the response protocol and about," he paused, "about several things, but those questions can wait 1 hour." She understood. The waiting was not for her benefit. The waiting was because there were 229 passengers and 5 crew to process, and 2 very ill pilots to get to hospital, and emergency vehicles to coordinate, and an aircraft sitting on a runway that needed to be moved, and none of those things could wait. She gave her headset to no one because there was no one to give it to, and she set it carefully on the center console, and she stood up. Wing Commander Khalid's F-16 did a low pass over the runway before diverting to Masroor. She heard it before she saw it through the windshield, a brief clean sound of a jet engine at low altitude in clean air, and she watched the aircraft climb back out to the west, back toward the sea, climbing through the haze into the clear air above. She stood at the top of the air stairs for a moment. The air tasted of asphalt and jet fuel and sea salt. It tasted like every air base she had ever stood on. It was not the same as the thin, high air she had been breathing at altitude. It was the specific air of arrival, of being on the ground when the ground is what you were trying to reach. There were television cameras at the terminal building. She could not see them clearly from this distance. She would deal with them later, or she would not, depending on what the next hour required. Sif Karim came down the airstairs behind her. He stopped beside her at the bottom. He was a structural engineer from Lahore, and he had spent 40 minutes in the right seat of a Boeing 737 writing down numbers and watching an aileron position indicator and listening for changes in engine sound. And he had done all of it without being asked twice and without demanding explanation, and she thought that this deserved acknowledgement. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her. He was still processing the last hour. She could see it on his face, the machinery of a person who understands systems trying to file what had just happened in a category that made sense. He said, "You knew what you were doing." "Not entirely." "Enough," he considered that. That's always what it is, isn't it? Not entirely enough. She did not answer, because it was true, and because true things sometimes did not need supplementing. The ambulance doors closed on Captain Hafiz. She watched it move toward the airport medical facility. She thought about what he had said on the runway, about the program, about what mattered. She thought about Farrokh Jamal, retired now, or so she had heard. She thought about the file that PCAA had been building for the past 6 years, the routine file, the one that said Safety Standards Officer, and had no mention of evaluation programs or resigned commissions or decisions made in rooms she had not been in. She wondered if that file looked different tonight. She did not know. She could not know yet. The institution moved at its own pace and with its own logic, and she had learned 11 years ago that demonstrating competence and receiving the institutional recognition of that competence were two events that could be separated by years, or by silence, or by nothing at all. But 229 people were walking through the terminal building. That was not silence. The investigation that followed was formal, methodical, and lasted 11 weeks. The food contamination incident was traced to a catering facility subcontracted through 3 layers of vendor arrangements, and the specific pathogen involved was identified within a week, and the regulatory action that followed involved the cancellation of 3 contracts and the referral of 2 individuals for criminal negligence proceedings. This was the clean part of the investigation, the part with clear causes and clear responses. The other part was less clean. In the PAF Air Operations Review, which ran parallel to the CAA investigation, there was a section on the pilot response that required Farida Raza to appear in person before a panel of 4 officers. 2 of them she had not met. One of them was Asin Khalid, wing commander, who sat at the end of the table and asked no questions and wrote things in a notebook throughout. One of them was Air Vice Marshal Norala, who chaired. They asked her to walk through every decision she had made from the moment she sat in the left seat to the moment the aircraft stopped. She did. They asked her about the autopilot disconnect decision, the timing, the logic. She told them. They asked her about the aileron discrepancy and her response to it. She told them. They asked her about the degree of input she had received from Captain Badi and Captain Hafiz, and whether she believed the landing outcome was primarily the result of that guidance or of her own skill. She thought about this question carefully before she answered it, because it was the kind of question that had 2 correct answers depending on what you wanted the answer to mean, and she had spent 11 years developing an allergy to answers shaped by what the questioner wanted to hear. She said, "The guidance was essential. The outcome was collaborative. If I had not had Badi and Hafiz, the approach would have been significantly more difficult. But no amount of guidance can land an aircraft. The pilot has to land the aircraft. Both things are true." The panel noted this. At the end of the session, as the panel was concluding, Norala said, "I want to be direct about something." She waited. "The training program you were in at Mushaf, the evaluation you left before completion." "Yes." "At this panel's request, we reviewed the record of that evaluation. The decision to remove you from the program was made by Air Commodore Farrokh Jamal, who cited operational integration concerns. That citation is in the record." He paused. "It is also in the record that your performance scores at the time of removal were in the top quartile of the evaluation cohort. That you had passed all but 2 of the required checks, and that the 2 remaining checks were not scheduled to occur for another 6 weeks." She said nothing. "The investigation does not extend to decisions made 11 years ago," Norala said. "That is outside our jurisdiction, but I want you to know that we looked." He closed the file. The investigation concluded 3 weeks later. Its primary recommendations concerned catering protocols, dual pilot incapacitation procedures, and the identification and registration of qualified aviation personnel traveling as passengers on commercial routes. This last recommendation was the one that got the most attention in the press, though not quite for the reasons the panel had intended. The press coverage was the thing she had least control over and spent the most energy managing. It began the night of the landing and did not quiet down for 6 weeks. The coverage in the first days was factual and then became inaccurate and then became celebratory in a way that made her uncomfortable, and the discomfort was not false modesty. It was the specific discomfort of someone watching a story be assembled from accurate pieces into a shape that was not quite accurate. The shape the story took was female XBAF pilot barred from flying jets saves aircraft, hero overcomes discrimination saves lives. This was not wrong, it was also not right. The part it left out, the part that mattered more to her than any of the rest, was the retirement of someone she had never met from a catering subcontractor facility in Site Industrial Area, who had been handling food safety certificates he was not qualified to administer. That person's removal was the reason 2 future pilots would not collapse over a Pakistani desert at altitude. That was the thing that would save more lives than her name in a news story. She said this in one interview. It appeared in the published version as a half paragraph at the end. She did not give more interviews. Hafiz recovered in 4 days. He called her from the hospital, which surprised her, because he had her number from the incident file and had clearly decided to use it in a way that was not strictly required by any protocol. He asked how she was. She said fine. She asked how he was. He said his stomach had opinions about the catering investigation that he preferred not to express in a formal setting. There was a pause and then she laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that comes out of you before you decide to release it, and it surprised her slightly. He said, the PCAA will do nothing about your records unless someone makes them. She said, I know. Khalid is making noise. Wing Commander Khalid should be careful whose noise he makes. He's not making it quietly. Another pause. You should not have been removed from that program. No. That is not. He stopped, started again. I want to be honest, I was flying for PIO when Jamal made that decision. I was not in the room. I did not know the details until the investigation surfaced them. But I have been in the industry for 22 years and I have heard how these things happen and he stopped again. I never did anything about how these things happen. That is a different kind of failure from Jamal's. I think you should know that I understand that. She thought about the right response for a long moment. She said, I know how systems work. They protect themselves first. Individuals are secondary. I made my choice and I built a life inside the system I had access to. That's not noble, it's just what happened. You could go back. To what? There are pathways, the PCAA certification. I'm 44. The Air Force has people older than 44 with type ratings. I'm 44 and I haven't flown in 3 years and I spent the worst 38 minutes of my life yesterday landing an aircraft I'm not certified for. And I need several weeks before I decide what any of that means. He said fair. And also, she said, and she had not planned to say this but said it anyway, I was terrified the entire time. Yes, he said, that's how you know it was real. She thought about that for a while after the call ended. The thing about terror was that it was honest. You could not perform terror. You could perform confidence, and she had performed it for 38 minutes with reasonable effectiveness. But underneath the performance was the real thing, which was a woman at 44 in an unfamiliar cockpit with unfamiliar aircraft under her hands, and 229 people who could not be allowed to know how much she did not know. The performance and the real thing had coexisted. That was the surprise, not that she had managed the fear, but that it had never interfered. The fear had sat in the background like an engine warning light that is on for a reason but has not yet reached the threshold where you must stop the aircraft. Present, monitored, not allowed to become the primary input. This, she understood, was not the same as courage. Or rather, it was precisely what courage was, which was not the absence of fear but the management of it, the ability to keep the fear from taking the controls while you used everything else you had. She had used everything she had. It had been enough. Barely. The PCAA issued a statement of commendation 3 weeks after the incident. It was formal and carefully worded, and it acknowledged her aviation background without making any statement about the circumstances under which that background had been abbreviated. She read it once and filed it. She went back to work. This surprised people more than anything else she had done. The colleagues who had heard about the incident and everyone had heard, It was impossible not to watch her return to the office and resume her work on runway surface friction audits and instrument calibration compliance records with a confusion that she understood. They had expected her to be changed, more visible, more something, more of whatever she had demonstrated in those 38 minutes. She was the same, mostly. The difference, if you were looking for it, was something small. In the 3 years since she had left the PAF and taken the PCAA position, she had developed a habit of sitting in aisle seats on commercial flights. Not because she was afraid, but because the window seat faced the engine and the engine reminded her of what she had walked away from, and it was easier not to be reminded. She booked a window seat on her first flight after the incident. She looked at the engine the entire time. Not with longing and not with peace and not with the neat resolution that stories of this kind were supposed to arrive at. She looked at it the way you look at a room you used to live in, with the recognition that you knew it better than you knew anything, and that knowing it was not the same as belonging in it, and that belonging was a separate question with a separate answer that took more time. She looked at the engine. The aircraft climbed. She did not touch the window shade. There is a question at the end of this story that I have deliberately left open, because it is not my question to answer. It belongs to every person who has ever sat in the waiting room of an institution and been told that their time has not come yet, to every person who was good enough but was told the room was not ready for them. To every person who built a life in a smaller space than they were meant to occupy and then, on one specific day, used everything they had ever learned to save someone else's future. The question is not whether Farida Raza deserved to be in that cockpit. She did not deserve to be in that cockpit. She was there because 2 men were incapacitated and the aircraft needed someone, and she was the person available. The question is, what does an institution owe the people it has misplaced? I do not know the answer. I think about it. I think you will too. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath in the approach, or thinking about what it means to be enough without being recognized as enough, then please leave a comment. Tell me what part of this story hit you hardest. Tell me if you have ever felt like Farida qualified for something you were not allowed to have. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I want to know who is sitting with these stories. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because this channel is not finished. There are more of these stories and they are worth staying for. Wing Commander Khalid's formal request to the PAF personnel branch asking for a review of the evaluation records from the Mushaf F-16 training program was acknowledged in writing 8 weeks after the incident. The acknowledgement said that the matter would be reviewed in due course. It gave no timeline. He filed a follow-up 60 days later. The follow-up was acknowledged. He was told the same thing. He was told it twice more over the following year. The matter was reviewed eventually by a subcommittee of 3 officers who produced a report of 14 pages that concluded the removal of then-Flight Lieutenant Raza from the F-16 evaluation program had been conducted within the existing regulatory framework at the time, that the exercise of command discretion by the relevant authority was consistent with the standards then in effect, and that no formal finding of procedural error could therefore be issued. The report was filed. Khalid received a copy. He put it on his desk and read it 3 times and then closed it. He did not give up. People who know what Khalid did next will understand why, and people who do not know are welcome to wonder. He did not make noise about it publicly. He did not involve the press. He made a specific phone call to a specific person at the air headquarters, and what was said in that call took 4 minutes, and the result of it took 3 more months to work through the administrative system. And what came out the other side was not a reversal of the old decision, because administrative systems do not reverse old decisions easily, and not an apology, because administrative systems almost never apologize. What came out was a letter. It was addressed to Farida Raza, PCAA Safety Standards Division. It informed her that in recognition of her demonstrated aviation proficiency, and in accordance with an initiative to identify and register qualified aviators for emergency resource purposes, the PAF was prepared to offer her a training pathway to a current qualification on a nominated type, subject to a medical assessment, a proficiency check, and the completion of a conversion course. It listed the nominated type. It was the F-16. She received the letter on a Tuesday morning. She read it at her desk between the 2 stacks of friction audit reports and the half-finished cup of tea that she had let go cold an hour before without noticing. She read it twice. She put it in her desk drawer. She picked up the friction audit and continued from where she had left off. She left the office that evening at the same time she always left. She took the same route. She stopped at the same place she always stopped, a small restaurant near the PCAA building where she sometimes ate when she did not want to cook, and she ordered the same thing and she sat at the same table. She thought about the letter for the entire meal. She thought about 44 years old and 3 years without flying, and a cockpit she had sat in 11 years ago as a younger person with a different calculation of what was possible. She thought about what Hafiz had said on the runway. She thought about what Khalid had said on the frequency, his voice compressed by the fighter's radio system, asking whether leaving the program had been her choice. She thought about Asif Karim, the structural engineer who had said, "Not entirely, enough." She went home. She took the letter out of her bag. She had put it in her bag before leaving the office without quite deciding to, and read it a third time. The conversion course was 12 weeks. The medical was routine. The proficiency check would be difficult and she would need to rebuild skills she had allowed to sit for 3 years and possibly more skills she had never fully completed, and there was no guarantee she would pass, and if she did not pass nothing changed, and if she did pass something changed but she did not know yet exactly what. She did not call anyone that night. She did not ask for opinions. She had spent 11 years learning to trust her own assessment of risk because the one time she had relied on an institution's assessment of what was possible, the assessment had been wrong and she had been the one to live with the wrongness. She wrote a response to the letter. She said she would attend the medical. She said she would complete the proficiency check. She said she understood this did not constitute a formal posting or a guaranteed outcome, and she accepted those terms. She sealed the envelope. She put it on her kitchen counter to mail in the morning. She slept. It was not a peaceful sleep and it was not a troubled sleep. It was the sleep of someone who has made a decision and is resting before the work begins, and the work is real and the resting is necessary, and the morning is coming whether you are ready or not. The morning came. She mailed the letter. On the runway at Karachi, before the air stairs had fully deployed, one of the younger flight attendants, not Sadia, who had composed herself completely, but a younger woman who had been in the rear galley and had spent 30 minutes holding 2 elderly passengers' hands while the aircraft descended, asked Farida a question. The question was, how did you know you could do it? Farida had been thinking about something else when the question arrived, and it took her a moment to understand what was being asked. She said, "I didn't." The flight attendant looked at her with an expression that said this was not the answer she had been hoping for. Farida said, "You don't know before, you find out during." The flight attendant thought about this. She nodded slowly in the way that people nod when they have received information they are going to need time to process. The air stairs were fully deployed. Farida walked down them. This is where the story ends, not with a medal, not with a promotion, not with a ceremony, because real stories do not end at the moment of maximum drama. They end later in the mundane aftermath, in the letters written at kitchen tables and the decisions made without witnesses. The ceremony is not the ending. The morning after is the ending. The return to work is the ending. The enrollment in a conversion course at 44 is the ending. The ending is whatever you decide to do when the system that once discarded you comes back around and offers you something that looks like a second chance, and you have to decide whether it is a second chance or just a different version of the original transaction. I do not know what Farida decided to do with the F-16 letter. The story I have told you is fiction. The pilot is not real. But the question the story is asking is real, and it is this. When an institution finally opens a door it should have opened years ago, does it owe you anything for the years the door was closed, and is the open door enough? Or do you walk through it with something different in your chest than you would have had at 28, not bitterness, because bitterness is too simple, but something more complex, something that is equal parts gratitude and grief, because the life you lived in the smaller space was a real life and you cannot have back the years of the larger one. I think about Farida often. I think about what she did with the letter. I think you will too. If you have made it this far, and I know you have, because the kind of person who watches this channel watches until the end, then you have earned the right to tell me what you think she chose. Comment below. Tell me what you would have done with that letter. Tell me what her answer should be. Tell me where in the world you are, because I want to know the geography of the people who sit with hard questions. Subscribe if you have not because I will remind you again, but because the next story will be worth finding, and if you are not here, you will miss it. And if you know someone who is qualified for something they have not been allowed to have, someone who is sitting in a seat they were not supposed to occupy but is the best person in the room, share this story with them. Not as a message, just as a story. stories do what explanations cannot. The aircraft was moved from the runway 6 hours after landing. By then, the field was operating normally. Other aircraft landed and departed on schedules that had been briefly delayed and then resumed. The airport had a specific quality in the late afternoon, the haze thinning, the light changing, the sound of approach traffic becoming regular again, that Farida noticed from the terminal building where she was still completing paperwork. She looked up once. She watched a 737 on final approach. Clean configuration, gear down on the slope. She watched it touch down. She went back to her paperwork. The tea they brought her was hot, which she appreciated, and she drank it without letting it go cold, which was a small and specific kind of discipline, the kind that matters when everything else is temporary and unreliable, the kind you practice not because someone is watching but because you are.